Hello, hello! It is me, Legendary, and I'm back with another Airborne Yap video. So today we're going to talk about the state of how air combat is going to play out against ground-based combat. So we're specifically looking into the PvE/VP scenario that is going to unfold with air, and mostly I'm going to be taking a look at how ground-based weapons can defend themselves against air raids. And I think this is probably the most important interaction that the Airborne update will showcase, because the freedom that these aircraft will have in the way that they can maneuver, as I've explained in previous videos, is a new mechanic that we will have to play around, similar to how we had to change how we build bunker bases when the introduction of self-propelled artillery, rail storm cannons, and battleships were added in the naval update. So yes, Airborne is adding in a whole bunch of new mechanics, but the most important and the crucial part on how it will play out in the rest of the frontline combat will be how do players defend themselves against aircraft, and how can we repel aircraft, or ultimately maybe even prevent them from doing their air raids altogether. So that's what the main discussion is going to be today. I'm not going to go into air PvP combat, as I simply don't have enough information just yet. The devs need to give us more info in showing how fighters essentially will work, and how the sort of cloud-based or the air-based combat will play out. So until we see more information about this, I'm just going to focus on how the current ground battlefield will look like in the next update. So, just to set the record here, let's talk about some of the assumptions that I have going into this chat video, and then I will also just talk about the state of the current version of Foxhole, because if you may or may not have noticed, Update 61 brought a lot of changes, and I am factoring in those changes into these insights that I'm giving today. So, first, I'm going on the assumption that there will be an air-only stratosphere layer above the world map. So that will be an area that aircraft can cross a border or a sky border into the upper layer, and then they can descend down from it to conduct their air raids, which is either doing strafing runs as a fighter bomber, or just simply dropping large bombs in a large aircraft, as we saw in the trailers. Additionally, I'm also going on the assumption here that high damage aircraft will be expensive. These are going to require large-scale collaboration. It's going to be intra-coalition level collaboration to build these aircraft, as I do see that the impact that these bombers will have on the battlefield will be significant. You really don't want every single player having access to bombers. That doesn't make obvious sense to me, as simply put, the devs have already shown us that very expensive, very impactful weapons come at a large scale cost. And we saw that with Update 61, with the rail storm cannon being very expensive, as well as the introduction of rare material consumption in the production of regular storm cannons as well as a couple of rebalancing of some of the other weapons that we have. So, long story short, bombers are going to be expensive, and mass destruction capable weapons are going to be expensive, so therefore there needs to be an appropriate level of counterplay from the ground-based perspective as well. Alright, so those are the two main assumptions. Bombers are going to be expensive, and there is an air layer. Next, let's talk about some of the changes in Update 61, because that has ultimately shifted how we look at bunker bases and the bunker base construction meta. Most importantly and most significantly, breaching was adding to the game. So breaching, for those who don't know, is if a particular bunker piece is hit with a breaching type of weapon. So currently we only have 3 of those, which is the Havoc Charge, the Electo push gun, as well as the reworked Jester rocket artillery. If a breaching weapon hits a bunker base, there is a chance that the bunker piece immediately becomes defunct, as it has been breached, and therefore cannot function in its normal capacity. There are other mechanics worked along that as well. Maybe that's a yap video in and itself. But for all you need to know is if something is very damaged or if it's hit with a very specific type of weapon, your bunker base can be breached, and that can make the bunker piece non-functioning. Additionally, the devs added the underground fortress. This is a new type of superstructure which I'll talk about near the end of the video, but essentially this is the first way that we can combat a type of damage without a direct counter. And this is significant because I do believe that bombers will fall into this category as well. So one of the ways that we might be able to defend ourselves is to simply not attack back. And the underground fortress is a very evident directional path that the devs have set us on that might be an alternative to the majority of counterplay that we're normally used to within Foxhole. And then finally, there was a lot of integration between facility and bunkers. Specifically, bunker bases can now be powered by facilities, as well as the introduction of water pipes to defend against fire. So it is also quite important that Update 61 sees more alignment between facility gameplay and bunker base building gameplay. And that is quite important for this video today as well, as we can clearly see that the devs really like this aspect of making things in the facility and then adding it to the bunker bases. Similar to how we see that interaction with large ships, because large ships are all made in facilities, as well as tank variants. So if you want your chieftain, you need to have a facility to make one. And that, again, that interaction is very favorable by the devs. So I will keep that in mind when we discuss the bunker base building aspect of today's video. All right, and then the final thing to just say is that there's only one update left before Update 63. So for those who don't know, Update 63 is officially the Airborne update. We are currently on build 61, so there is still build 62. And this will be the last opportunity for Siege Camp to really mess around with things before the patch drops, or the ultimate update drops. So, Siege Camp needs to dial in exactly what the Airborne experience is going to be in this next update, and after Update 62, then we can really start to hone in on exactly what the devs have cooking. And then hopefully in the Update 62 dev stream, they will reveal more information about what we can expect from the major update later this year. But for now, this is where things are at. So let's actually just move along and talk about what today's video is basically going to be entailing. And as I said, it's going to be air versus ground versus air based combat. So how can we attack aircraft? If you're a ground plebeian, or if you're just an infantry on the front, or if you're a bunker based designer, how will you actually be able to fight off aircraft? Now, first and foremost, I do need to say that the primary way that bombers will be combated against will be fighter QRF. I think that's the main gameplay loop that the devs have in mind, and we've seen this similar interaction with the naval update. If you want to fight off a battleship, you need something like a submarine or a destroyer or multiple gunboats. There is no perfect ground-based weapon to fight it off with. But because aircraft have incredibly far range, I do think that the devs are putting in a little bit more tools for us so that we can at least sustain damage against aircraft, as well as implement some mechanics to defend ourselves in a semi-realistic way. But before we can talk about those weapons, we have to talk about the game engine and the limitations that the game engine has in the primary gameplay loop. Specifically, Foxhole's aiming system. So within Foxhole, the aiming system on the surface is quite simple. You basically equip a weapon, make sure it is loaded, and then you hold the right mouse button down and you get an aim line. You intersect that aim line with a target, and then you left click, and voila, it deals damage and life is good. However, this level of simplicity is actually quite complex in what is happening in the background. And we can see this with the way that many weapons can be aimed in different manners. So, for example, a primary concern that a lot of Warden players have is when they equip an RPG launcher like a Cutler, and they're trying to shoot a bunker base and there's an obstacle in front of the bunker base itself, then more often than not, their rocket will either miss by flying over the target, or it will hit something before their intended target, therefore wasting their shot. So even though the aiming system is quite simple, the actual mechanic of a projectile leaving a weapon and then hitting the target can be quite complex and can be very, very frustrating. Now, the core reason why I'm talking about this is when you're on the ground, we need to now start figuring out how we can attack aircraft. And we need to think about how that mechanically will actually play out. Since we don't have a way to directly change the height of our shots, we do run into a scenario like this where you think you can hit a target very easily, but if they're within the proximity of a taller object, then no matter what you do when you fire your weapon, you simply don't hit the mark, or you struggle to hit it, and obviously there's an opportunity for players to shoot back. If you're a consumer of my YouTube shorts, you may have seen some of my most recent YouTube shorts where I struggle to hit targets that are within enclosed spaces. So here are just two main examples. The one is where I boarded the 420th submarine in War 124, and I unloaded an entire clip of dusk ammo into the primary sort of area that the engine rooms are in, and multiple 420th members came to rush and QRF me, but my shots were simply missing. And the reason for this is the simplistic aiming system within Foxhole was playing against me. What resulted in this is my bullets were actually hitting the top of the room that I was in. And again, I'm just pointing this out, the fact that A, I'm sometimes really bad at shooting, but also B, there is a problem with the aiming mechanic bouncing off of unintended targets that come within the aim line. And this is something that is a major concern, and I think there isn't really a good way for the devs to fix it. And secondly, in my very most recent clip in the current war, you can see that I boarded a Warden gunboat that had some interesting players that are repairing it from the inside. And again, ultimately here I had a Fushino rifle and I fired off a bunch of bullets here, but unfortunately, again, the aiming line screwed me over, because here you can clearly see that I'm trying to aim behind this staff sergeant over here, and the aiming reticle is clearly cutting through them, but ultimately the bullet would hit the top of the Ronin's canopy. And again, that is not an interaction that I want to have. So the net result of this is the simple aiming line can cause a lot of troubles if I'm trying to aim for different targets. So here, when I'm just in regular gameplay and now suddenly an aircraft is flying overhead, there is a chance that my aim line might just go completely haywire, and no matter what I do, I just fire my rifle and it's hitting the aircraft and doing no damage because it probably has some resistance to 7.62. And then ultimately what this could mean is players that are underneath aircraft could easily counterattack without any retaliation from my side. There's literally no way that I can get my aim line back down to shoot accordingly unless I do some weird tricks of aiming at hay bales and then looking left and then looking right, and very complex maneuvers for a very simple outcome. So because of this, I truly hold that this will not be an interaction that we will see on ground-based air defense. We're not going to see weapons that can simply just aim straight up by holding right mouse button and left clicking, because of running into situations like this where unintended targets get hit, causes a lot of confusion, causes a lot of complexities, and ultimately the player experience will be, hey, I'm shooting an aircraft but nothing is happening, because you might just be hitting something in the way, or you might not be able to counterplay against defending from regular ground versus ground combat. So I don't think we're going to see this interaction. If you want to shoot an aircraft, it's going to have to engage in a different mechanic. Now, what are some of the solutions to this? Well, one of the sort of like wild ones that I've been thinking of, and a lot of people have been saying, is maybe we get a first person mode in Foxhole, and if you climb into a particular aircraft weapon and then you press a button to change its firing mode, maybe we go into like this weird FPS game, kind of like that one mission in Call of Duty 5. Or, you know, some of these, some content creators who have been experimenting with the VR compatible add-on for Unreal Engine, and some people have been playing in that. I don't think that this is quite the solution that the game devs also have in mind. It would be really cool to see, and I'm sure we're probably going to see some guys with VR headsets or VR mode looking at bombs dropping on top of them and maybe trying to shoot them. But realistically speaking, I don't think this is what the games, the Siege Camp game devs have envisioned for it. I think they're going to stick with their guns, ha ha ha. I think they're actually going to make sure that we're inside of particular weapons that can fire up, but maybe that will be in a different perspective or in a different gameplay loop that we're sort of familiar with, but will be a little bit new to as well. And of course, I stole this image from Robert. I love you, Robert. Please go check out his YouTube channel. He is very much the primary YouTube content creator alongside Freerk. I love both of them. Go check out their content. And thanks for allowing me to copy and paste this image, even though I didn't ask, but I'm sure you'll be fine with it. Okay, so here is a prediction. I think that General Gear won't be able to aim up. So if an aircraft shows up and you need to shoot at it, I don't think that's going to be from a regular primary weapon or secondary weapon that you have in a standard infantry kit gear whatsoever. So most weapons that are found in bunker bases, which will be your rifles and your fiddler SMGs or your RPGs, etc., I generally don't think we'll be able to shoot up because of the limitations of the aiming system. It's too complicated, even though it is a simple system so that anyone can use it. So generally speaking, I don't think infantry gear will be able to harm aircraft that are mid-flight. There probably is some realistic reasons for that as well, something to do with bullet velocity and things like that. But again, that's not my primary reason why I don't think this will be the case. I think it's literally just because the aim line is complete and utter craziness when you're trying to hit a target that's not on the same level as you or sometimes has something above it. So there needs to be a different way for us to fight aircraft when we're defending a bunker base or on an active front, for example. So the way that I think that this is going to work is indirect weapons will become a primary way for us to engage with aircraft at different layers depending on where they are currently located. So the easiest solution that I think Siege Camp will probably go for is implement another way to use indirect fire. So if you're unsure what indirect fire is, essentially artillery guns is a primary example of what indirect fire is. You simply aim at a particular location, you load a shell or a ordnance into your gun, you reload and you fire the weapon, and then hopefully you hit the mark based on a spotting from another player. So yes, I think the primary way that we're going to be defending ourselves against aircraft is going to be akin to artillery defense. However, because we're facing off against airborne targets and not ground-based targets that can easily be spotted using binoculars, there are some nuances with how the weapons will function. So out the gate, I think that the weapons that will be immediately applied to ground-to-air-based combat is going to be mortars. It's going to be light artillery or quote-unquote 120mm weapons. It will be heavy artillery or quote-unquote 150mm weapons, as well as rocket artillery. And I think these four primary artillery sources will simply just have a different firing mode as well as some different aspects to it that will allow us to engage an aircraft in the air hex as well as on the ground as well. But do note that siege artillery, specifically 300mm and 250mm, I think those will probably stay landlocked, as those are specifically used for attacking bunkers, whereas traditionally artillery is flexible enough to be hitting a large range of targets, be it from infantry, tanks, bunker bases, long range as well. So I do think that there is a distinction to be made here. So essentially everything from a mortar level platform to a rocket artillery platform or a heavy artillery platform, those are all fair game to attack aircraft with. Right. Additionally, I also think that the devs are going to change a lot of functionality of existing defensive weapons to also hit aircraft. And there is a distinction between artillery-based platforms and emplaced weapon platforms. And I draw this distinction between them being simplistic as well as them being artillery-based defensive weapons. So in this example, I also predict that all the emplaced weapons that we're accustomed to, at least the direct fire emplaced weapons, such as both Faction's 12.7 emplaced machine gun, the Warden 68, the Warden Starbreaker, the Colonial Raptura, and also the Colonial emplaced rocket battery, because we don't have an emplaced 120 platform. These will all be added to an indirect fire mode that will allow us to combat aircraft that are local within the region that we're in. Another reason why I think this is purely based on the description. If you go look at the Warden's in-game description about what their 12.7 emplaced machine gun is, it was originally a repurposed anti-aircraft flak cannon. So I don't think it's too unreasonable to think that that functionality might be brought back into the game, but in lieu of it, again, just being a direct fire weapon that we're currently accustomed to, instead it will have a alternate firing mode that will allow us to shoot aircraft in a flak-based capacity. Additionally, I also have been thinking about this slide a lot. So this slide was taken from the Inferno update dev stream, and this is the Colonial 12.7 that they added to, again, bring more asymmetry into the game. But essentially it does the same thing as the Warden one, except one thing that always bothered me with this emplaced machine gun was literally the fact that it's supposed to be operated by two. And if you've ever played on one of these EMGs before, you can actually put a player character sitting on the other side of this machine gun. And I have a problem with this because that player character literally doesn't do anything. They just stand there. You can't use any weapons. So I've always been a little bit baffled about why this EMG has a crew of two. Maybe the devs originally envisioned that you're supposed to turn the gun with one player and shoot with another, but then the Warden one, you can just use one player to use it. So this is a very confusing aspect of this weapon, and a lot of the other Colonial weapons also have this particular problem, specifically the Raptura. So I think maybe, although not directly envisioned for air, I do think that this might have another purpose that could realistically make sense if we just sit and think about it when it comes to in-hex anti-air combat. So, the new indirect weapon changes. How will they specifically work? And here I'm talking about the new weapons as opposed to the artillery, which I'll touch on again in just a bit. So, for this prediction, I do think that having a new indirect weapon will allow us to shoot up by simply toggling the weapon back to an indirect fire mode, similar to how you can swap between a direct mortar fire from a gunboat to an indirect mortar fire from a gunboat as well. Additionally, to fire the weapon correctly and to hit your mark, you're going to need a spotter in the second position to guide the gunner, similar to how a spotter for artillery would guide the shell to the target so that it can hit accordingly. So what this would mean is the primary gunner for all the sort of emplaced weapons will have to have a spotter in the secondary position to guide them, and then ultimately they will have the responsibility of turning the azimuth as well as adjusting the range, and then fire in an automatic sort of hitbox in the sky that will basically translate damage to any aircraft in its direct vicinity. So it plays very similar to artillery, and it's a gameplay loop that we're all experienced in as Foxhole players, but it is new in the fact that it will probably require significantly less coordination to successfully pull off. The main reason for this is it will most likely not be affected by wind. This has always been one of the major counterplays to artillery, and why it has been so effective is artillery is affected by wind when you launch the shell out, and it requires a lot of adjustment, and it requires constant spotter vigilance to ensure that your shells constantly land. And I don't think that gameplay loop will be very successful when you're dealing with a large threat like aircraft entering your hex and coming to bombard a position that you're currently holding. So the upside of it being easier to hit your targets is the fact that the weapon itself will probably not arc down afterwards. So you're not going to have Emplaced 68 artillery, for example. But you can, in a pinch, turn your Emplaced 68 up. You'll need a spotter to see the aircraft overhead for you. They need to yell where the azimuth and the range is, and then ultimately you can press the fire button and cause some damage to any aircraft that are literally honing in on a target within your hex. So to me, this is the primary entry-level anti-aircraft weaponry, and it's very similar to mortars being the entry-level weapon for artillery-based gameplay. Like I alluded to in Airborne Yap video number 2, every aspect of Foxhole needs a way for lower rank players, new players, or simply quick and easy but low damage and low effective weapons to have a gameplay loop that people can experience. So to me, if you want to defend yourself against an airplane without another airplane, jump on the EMG, jump on the EAT, jump on the 75, jump on the Starbreaker, and defend what you can with a little bit of coordination and help from a spotter nearby. One more thing to note is the reason why I say spotter in a second position. The gunner itself will obviously be restricted, will have restricted vision because it'll be below surface. It's similar to artillery gunners where the person loading the shell and firing the weapon doesn't inherently get to see if the shell is landing or not, simply because it requires two players to coordinate and use. So I'm also a little bit hesitant about just giving EMG players the ability to just see up themselves. I think it would be a little bit strange if they did that, just because that would make it a vastly different game mechanic that we will have to get used to. And similar to all the previous additions to the game, the devs tend to lean into existing gameplay loops that we have some experience in, but obviously not the perfect solution for things. And the other problem that I have is if a EMG is set into anti-aircraft mode and a player jumps on, I also think that the player in that spotter position won't be able to see ground-based targets anymore. Or else we run into the very obnoxious problem of having players use the dry dock binos, if you know what that is. Luckily, that's mostly been patched out. It can't be performed anymore, but it just simply gave players an unfair advantage of increasing their point of view for no downside whatsoever. So I don't think EMGs will simply just have you jump on it and you have this sort of like overhead view of the battlefield because you have to target down aircraft. I do think that there will be some restrictions in place, and that's why I wholeheartedly believe that firing upon aircraft will require indirect combat and the same gameplay loop of directing shots and hopefully calling out hits or misses and adjusting accordingly. Okay, so long story short, simple anti-air will be an up range will be limited to in-hex combat. What this means is if you're in an EMG or an EAT or a 75 or a 94, you can only hit planes inside your current hex. Now, I want to do a small mock-up of how I think this would work. Obviously, this is not a direct correlation to what I explained, but the idea here is if you're going to be defending against aircraft that are currently lining up their shots, they're currently about to do their strafing run, they're about to drop their bombs, then you're going to have to use EMGs, 75, EATs, etc. to do so. Now, for out of hex anti-air combat, so let's say that there's an aircraft hovering overhead your current region and it's about to come down, or God forbid it sits in a border queue or something like that from the air hex trying to get in to come shoot, maybe there needs to be some counterplay for that as well. And that's where the traditional artillery comes into play. So again, here we have an introductory level to doing ground-to-air based combat across hex, and that will start with things like mortars and heavy artillery. And again, these weapons will also have an alternative firing mode similar to the EMGs, but as opposed to the EMGs that can shoot in hex, these will now shoot into the air layer, or the stratosphere layer as I called it in previous videos. Additionally, these weapons will also require new ammunition. There's always an important factor to keep in play when we're talking about region to region based combat. It usually has to use bespoke weapons or bespoke ammunition types, and I feel like this design pattern has to hold true for ground to high air or high altitude based combat. You can't just use 120 shells that you have 1,000 shells of lying around somewhere. You're going to have to make a new shell that is specifically tailor-made to explode mid-air and hit the targets high above the air to provide some level of protection to your bunker bases. So all the existing artillery platforms that are used for indirect air combat will require a new shell of some kind. So what these shells are and how they're made, probably facility locked, probably not mass produced except maybe a mortar type, but obviously there would be a direct correlation to swap out the weapons, and the devs will have to communicate clearly where these shells are produced and how they would be effective. But ultimately what this means is, if you want to shoot an aircraft that is about to enter your hex or is retreating and provide some air support, you'd probably be able to do something like an anti-air mortar that sort of like explodes into a cloud of shrapnel that an airplane flies through that takes some damage. Similar to a rocket, maybe there'll be a new shell for the Emplaced 120 gun that also, again, explodes into like a flak-based cloud. And then ultimately 150 guns, which will primarily be the way to defend against an incoming bomber raid, will also use a shrapnel-based artillery shell that explodes in midair, causing debris when the aircraft flies through it. So for ground to air layer based combat, we're going to be using the existing artillery systems that we have, but we will probably need a new shell or a new weapon type to use for it. And I'm fairly sure these are going to be facility locked. I see no reason for the devs to not do it, as most new weaponry that has been added to the game requires a run through the ammunition factory facility structure. Right. So there are some tiers to this combat as well. If you're only fighting against fighters or bomber fighters or a class of that kind, or scouts, then your 120mm emplaced gun, your rocket emplaced gun, and your mortars, that will probably be the way you can defend against that. And in a pinch could probably also be effective against bombers. But I do believe that bombers, being a very late game tech, almost super weapon classification of vessel or weapons platform, you'll probably have to use a very bespoke 150mm platform based anti-air artillery shell to significantly perfectly counter any bombers that are approaching your fixed position. All right, so that's what I think primary from the ground to high altitude combat will look like. We're going to be making use of the existing artillery systems, just adjusting the firing mode. So instead of doing a arc shot into a ground-based target, instead we just fire straight into the sky, and the ordnance, special ordnance, will explode mid-air, causing shrapnel, which will be the primary way for us to harm aircraft approaching the position. All right, but one thing you might be asking is, well, what about spotting? how we will be able to spot across hexes. And this is something that I've been umming and ahhing about over the last couple of weeks, because this is quite a complex system to really think about. If the devs are going to be adding in an alternative to artillery, but with the artillery-based gameplay loop, they also need to add in a system for us to spot aircraft in hex as well. So for that reason, I think there will probably be some form of ways to detect aircraft approaching position, but not give direct vision, similar to how we would expect from something like an observation bunker. Now, of course, this would add in a complete new mechanic in the game, and that is being able to detect enemies from outside the region that you're in. And mechanically, this could be very complicated to implement, as the way that servers work is you can usually track player positions from the server itself by relaying the positions of players locally within your own hex. Now, it works relatively well when you are looking at targets within your own hex, but very, very rarely, and I do mean it, even the Intel map sometimes struggle to track targets that are coming from outside your region into yours, and then you're getting a relatively good position to see where they're coming from. The primary reason why I say this is a lot of rail storm cannon ops, or even storm cannon ops, heavily rely on a player going to a target region, being in hex, and then seeing where and how the shells land based on wind conditions. Very, very rarely do we rely on the region map to simply just coordinate those attacks, unless you're incredibly skilled and very, very, very confident in how the shells will land and apply damage accordingly. But for ground-to-air based combat, we now need a way to spot aircraft coming from a hex that is above us. So I do think that one of the ways, or one of the reasons I predict that this could work, is to lean something in like the sonar operator that position that we have on large ships, where instead of giving an exact coordinate or a direct visionary confirmation of an aircraft above hex, we have something like a translated position that can be detected from a new type of structure that could be able to spot where this is coming from. So one of the big predictions that I have here is to spot aircraft above hex, we would need to require a new type of system in place. So how will this system work? And this is where I leaned into the content that was revealed in update 61, and that is the introduction of facility-built superstructures within bunkers. So I think the devs are going to add in new support structures into bunker bases to help us combat air-based assaults. So the devs basically paved the way by making bunker bases more dynamic, removing a lot of restrictions and making the construction of bunker bases a lot more compact and a lot more easier. And I do think that one of the ways that this was subtly added was through the change to the weather station. Yes, the stupid weather station that the devs added, I think has paved the way and also indicated that the devs are open to adding in super bunker structures to bunker-based builds that don't rely on the very difficult to get advanced bunker tech that requires a lot of coordination and a lot of construction and deconstruction to eventually get the tech online for an applicable use case. So with the current meta, it's very easy to prep a superstructure bunker base now that concrete is no longer tech locked, or at least bunker tech locked. You can pre-build a 3x3 advanced structure platform, and then you use a facility to construct the parts that you need to then build and add it to your bunker network. And ideally, this would integrate directly into facility gameplay. Again, something I alluded to near the start of the video, And I do think the devs honestly just love that shit, to put it bluntly. I really do think that the devs like the fact that to build an advanced bunker or to add more utility to that bunker, you can simply just pre-build the parts that you need in a facility. It makes Logi players happy, it makes facility-based gameplay happy, and then you move in, you build all the things that you need, and then you deploy it onto your bunker base, and then you just need to wait for it to set in place, etc. So also allows these new support structures as viable options for push bunkers, and essentially all you need is just tier 2 support bunker base structure similar to the weather station, and this will allow your push bunkers and your in-base defenses to have a way to spot aircraft that are maneuvering above head. So what are the two new support structures that I have in mind? Well, dipping into a little bit of history here, there will probably be something like a very simple and easy to assemble surface to air radar. So this is just a very simple mechanical structure that looks for disturbances of objects maneuvering within the sky, and then bouncing a signal off of it and detecting a change in those signal bounces. So that would be a surface to air radar. And then more importantly, it will also allow us to build something like a long range radar to detect fluctuations of airspace above the ground surface. So how will these structures play out, and why are they different? Why are they not one simple base structure? Well, again, I'm leading into the fact here that this surface to air radar is primarily the way that you're going to be directing your ground to air based artillery platforms to fight aircraft, and the long range radar will be used for a different purpose. And they have very important prerequisites that are different from each other. The surface to air radar is only useful for, or only requires support bunkers too. That's what you need to make concrete observation bunkers. And then the long range radar will serve a completely different purpose, and that's where advanced bunkers will be its prerequisite, similar to a storm cannon or intel center. So let's talk about the surface to air radar first. This is what you're going to need to spot aircraft in the hex above you. It will play similar to the sonar operator role in large ships like destroyers, frigates, or submarines. And it should easily be built using facility parts and then deployed similarly very easily using a crane, almost like how weather stations are now. It should be like a weather station, easy to build structure, shouldn't require a lot of rare materials, and is essentially an observation bunker for you to detect aircraft above head, so that you can then direct your artillery platforms to open fire and hopefully cause them to take some damage and reconsider performing a drop into your hex to cause some trouble. The other radar to keep in mind here that I have envisioned is the long range radar, and this plays much more differently than the aforementioned radar, because this one, unlike its spotting position, will allow it to detect aircraft similar to a observation tower or lighthouse that you might be accustomed to. Now, it is very important to note that the long range radar acts as an advanced air raid warning system. This will similarly be used as your primary way to detect enemy aircraft that are approaching a particular position that you're hoping to defend. And similarly, its primary goal is to work as a wedge against an enemy air assault coming towards that location. And what I mean by this is there are superstructures within Foxhole that act as a wedge to particular types of attacks coming in. The primary one that we know of so far is the storm cannon. So the storm cannon acts as a wedge for long-range artillery entering your hex. So it is a way to defend against long-range artillery by assaulting across a particular region border. This is what I have envisioned for the long-range radar. It is something that you build to detect an incoming attack way beforehand. So it's in between a storm cannon in significance and a intel center in utility. And this is what I have in mind for it. And it's supposed to be a priority target for the enemy faction. If you're in a regiment that is going to be specializing in conducting air raids, this will be a primary target. This is something that you will want to kill. Yes, the previous structure, which is the surface-to-air radar, allows players to spot aircraft using radar pings on the ground surface. This is something that players will use to detect your aircraft way in advance to prepare a QRF accordingly. So this should be something that you want to kill. We all know that storm cannons are always a priority target because they can cause untold devastation and can pincer a region and lock it down to prevent any future attacks coming from a border. This is something that could put a wedge in air raids. And I want to point out the fact that this is supposed to be an important structure to build, an important structure to defend, and also an important structure to destroy if you want to conduct air raids. One additional benefit that this aircraft will also have is the following. The long-distance radar will allow AI garrisons to defend against air passively. So what does this mean? Well, when you build a bunker base, garrisons normally defend themselves when they get attacked first as a retaliatory strike. Most of us know what retaliation is, but essentially for new players who don't understand, when you attack a bunker piece, the bunker piece will shoot back. This is a counterplay mechanic. And sometimes when you venture too close to a bunker base, it might just turn the guns and shoot at you automatically. This does not apply to howitzer garrisons, or now called artillery garrisons in the game, because those only respond to the initial strike that land upon them. This superstructure will make your passive defenses actively shoot at a target approaching it if it is detected. And it requires both artillery garrisons to be built as well as the LD radar existing within your bunker network. So let me just explain a little bit so that people clearly understand how the LD radar is supposed to function. So here I have a scenario where I have a bunker base and it has a couple of howitzer garrisons, and these will retaliate to aircraft strikes that might approach my bunker base that I've built. So here in this scenario, I have a bomber, an enemy bomber flies overhead, drops a couple of bombs on my bunker base, and just like normal, the bunker base will shoot back at it as retaliatory strike as expected. So by default, bunker bases will allow for retaliatory strikes against aircraft appropriately. So your howitzer garrisons will still play as normal. However, there is a new problem that we've seen in the game, and that is bunker base breaching. Again, update 61 added this mechanic that if your bunker base gets hit with a special type of ordnance, or it has taken significant amount of damage and gets hit by an explosive, there is a chance for the bunker base to simply collapse and become defunct for that particular piece. So in the previous example, we can run the risk of a bomber approaching, it hits our bunker base, and then all the howitzers randomly get sunk in because of bunker base and hull breach integrity, and our bunker base simply gets destroyed from that point because the first bomber hits it all, they all get destroyed, and the bomber gets away, and essentially it is the end of that bunker base life cycle. So this is a problem that is now present in the game. The LD radar is something to counteract this because by adding it to your bunker base, it provides two important services for the defense of your bunker network. First, it will add in a detection method in the intel map. So here you can see I've basically just taken a screenshot of how the in-game observation towers work. So when you build a LD radar, it will provide intelligence in some area of effect. It could be a cone, it could be a circle, it could be something that the devs figure out. But ultimately, this is something to detect an air raid from multiple hexes away so that you can have more time to cure F attack coming in, either preparing the defenses themselves, getting them manned, or adding in more BMATs to repair the strike as it approaches. And again, this is a way for us to detect the aircraft coming from a region that is normally only locked to air-based play. So a superstructure made from concrete to detect an incoming attack. But most importantly, when the LD radar is attached to the rest of your bunker network, it now turns your howitzers or your other defenses into something that will actively shoot aircraft when they enter their engagement range. So previously, you had to wait for the aircraft to hit it beforehand, but with an attached LDR, now all your garrisons are a way to attack the bomber and hopefully take it down before it can cause a serious amount of damage. So now in this situation, because the LD radar is attached to my bunker network, as the aircraft enters the howitzer's engagement range, it will then turn and shoot and cause some damage to the aircraft, hopefully getting it to go away. So now I have a way to defend my bunker base while I'm offline, or while I'm doing something else, or while I'm, essentially playing other aspects of the game instead of just sitting on an AA gun 24/7. Now you might be asking for yourself, well, Legendary, why would you want to add this complicated superstructure that I need a facility to build? Well, the main reason for this is nothing in Foxhole has a perfect counter. We've seen this multiple times again. The devs constantly push new weapons and there are always counterplay to them. Bombers should not just have a no counter system that we can't do anything about. That's bad. That's a bad game mechanic. If bombers are an in-game tech weapon, where if you have a bomber above your bunker base, there's nothing that you can do, that is a bad gameplay loop for the players that are building the bunker base. And similarly, if you have a bomber and every single bunker base has an automatic anti-aircraft garrison built into it, built at tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 now, again, sticking to that gameplay vision that the devs have, we also have the problem of bombers being completely useless. So why should I put in the effort of building the bomber if it can't have any direct usage? At least with having something like the LD radar being locked to advanced bunkers, requiring concrete, requiring resources, require floor planning to function accordingly, at least now bombers will have designated areas that they could assault without the fear of direct passive retaliatory strikes. And again, I just want to nail this point in thoroughly. Yes, there are direct counters in the game, but they're never perfect counters. So in this example here, if you're an infantry and you run into an MG, you get counterplayed. However, infantry still have a way to play against it. So if you add in a flamethrower on an infantry, they can now counter a rifle garrison, with some precision added to it. And again, if you're in a tank and you want to shoot an 80 garrison, the 80 garrison will normally win, unless you use a tank that is specifically designed to fight off against 80 pieces as well. So even the most oppressive weapons in the game require perfect conditions to be useful. So therefore, this logic needs to be applied in this ground versus air-based combat scenario. And to me, that's the prime reason why there won't be an AA gun garrisons. I wholeheartedly believe that we're not going to just be able to hammer out a tier 1 anti-aircraft gun. It might be the case, but I do think that having your aircraft completely countered by something that you could just hammer out in a bunker base will make the aircraft a lot less useful to use. So an all-encompassing anti-aircraft weapon, I think, will be unlikely. Like I said, aircraft, very expensive to make. Passive defenses are usually just used to counter small groups. And active man defenses are always more effective, but requires player participation. And I think if there's an air raid coming, it's going to be a region-based event. Everyone is going to yell, "Oh my god, bombers incoming, we need to defend it, we need to QRF it." I think that's the sort of gameplay loop that the devs envision for Airborne itself. So I think with the introduction of an LD radar, we will at least have some defense against low pop assaults. Again, devs have also been nailing down this no low pop nonsense, tap ops, and things like that. And it would be very weird of them to not at least have something to defend against it. So, again, we also don't have the perfect solution. With naval being out for the last 2 years, we still don't have a player-built coastal gun, like a true coastal gun that will just destroy large ships when they enter a region. That is also unfair on the people building the battleships. That is also unfair on people who enjoy playing on destroyers and frigates. So we're not going to get a perfect solution, but we're going to be given something to prevent players from being absolute heroes and destroying everything in a single bomber run. But it will require a lot of coordination to build, maintain, and use. So this is why I think the LD radar is a good middle ground, because it also doesn't require players to add redundant anti-aircraft batteries to absolutely everything that they try and build. So a little bit of middle ground. And the middle ground, to me, the perfect solution for this is to have a superstructure. You build it in your bunker base. It provides a very clear supportive measure. It becomes a priority target for players to partisan and to take out, because if you take out an LD radar, you can take out an entire fortified position. That might be something that a regiment might want to perform an op on. So, yeah, I really do think that we are going to get passive defenses, but it's not going to be an AA gun garrison. I'd be very surprised if it does, but I might be wrong. But I truly think that we're going to be using existing garrisons in the game, but you attach a new support structure to it, and then magically that will now provide a quote-unquote no-fly zone for that bunker base, and then people who have bombers will need to choose a different priority target, or, you know, sometimes just sacrifice 3 bombers to take out the LD radar, and then the rest of the base becomes vulnerable. And that could be a super cool event, you know, similar to like Nuke Jade Cove, you know. Hyped up, heightened, high point for players, both attacking and defending, to see their bunker base survive, or they destroy the LD radar. The bunker is now a big threat to be destroyed by remaining airstrikes. So could be super interesting, and again, faction-wide event that everyone can participate in. So also in short, because you're not getting an AA garrison, this is just, I think the devs are going to be like, no, if you want to defend against aircraft, the perfect solution is you're going to have to just get in the AA gun. And I thought this would be a sort of funny way to justify the fact that if you want to hold off against bombers, you know, get in the AA gun, bro, and then just smile and hope for the best. All right. Right, but back to the long distance radar, so the LDR. Again, I do think that a superstructure makes it feasible to defend mid and backlines. As I alluded to, the devs have been very active in counteracting the effects that small partisan groups have on the majority of backline facilities. There are still some interactions that the devs are probably going to take a look at, hopefully before the final update 63 build. But in update 61, we did see that more prominent defenses against things like tap-ups or small partisan groups being able to have a significant impact on the outcome of a war taking place. So the primary way that this was changed is tier 3 garrison houses, town bases, and relic bases now fire 30 mil at vehicles. They no longer have drop-off range, and they also have a ramping attack. This makes it very difficult for players to sort of sneak into backlines and destroy a base and then tap it and losing the intel. It did happen once in War 126, where a bunch of Wardens broke into a relic base in Reaver's Pass, I believe, and they were able to do that. But again, I think these are systems that the devs are actively developing to prevent that from happening, because it is overall just a bad experience loop for the receiving end. But if it fails, it's a lot of player wasted effort on the attackers as well. So Overall, probably not the greatest solution that the devs have in mind yet, but they're actively working on it. So I also think that aircraft being able to go from point A to point B on the map, going through, not going from hex to hex and having a lot of ways to sneak into regions to cause trouble, will require a coordinated defensive effort that needs to be able to be implemented so that Logi lines can be defended meaningfully. And I think that having an advanced bunker structure, again, storm cannon level threat for people who want to use aircraft, would be an appropriate way to set up some level of defense. So again, leaning into the fact that bunker bases already exist inside backlines, there are something that players have just adapted because partisans are already in the game. So if there isn't some level of active anti-air coordinated defense, excluding the fact that I do think that garrisons will have retaliatory strikes, then again, dive bombers and large aircraft will have a huge problem if they are able to sneak into a critical structure line, because paradrops are going to be a thing. Paradropping partisans into a facility could be extremely chaotic and disruptive, but also just the fact that, you know, high explosive yield anti-structure bombs could also cause a lot of trouble. So again, I think the LD radar is a good way to have some level of gameplay against it. All right, so ultimately, what will this result in? So let's assume that the LD radar becomes a superstructure, people start to build it. What will this mean if you are into aircraft-based gameplay? Well, in an ideal world where everyone coordinates and everyone works, we're probably going to see something like this. We're probably going to have no-fly zones in backline hexes. These will be the responsibility of regiments and coalitions to organize where LD radars will go in place, so that if a bomber comes down from the stratosphere layer, enters a hex, it will at least get shot down before it can cause any significant problems. So what this means is if you're going to be playing with aircraft, I think deep strikes into Logi hexes will probably be unviable. We've seen some of this gameplay with submarines, specifically Wardenaki submarines sneaking into sort of backline hexes and causing trouble like that. But I also do think that that is probably a gameplay loop that the devs aren't actively happy about, because they seem to be punishing partisan gameplay loop like that. And I do think that a quote-unquote partisan bomber or partisan dive bomber will also not be allowed to really play as freely as one may think. So LDRs, or long-distance radars, are a way to curb that gameplay loop. And so I think that might be something that the devs are actively cooking up. But that being said, hexes that don't have LDRs and primarily rely on the surface-to-air radars for active anti-air defense will be the playgrounds that bombers and strike bombers or or dive bombers can play in, because here it's basically free reign. So if you see like a tier 2 base that's about to take to tier 3, or if you see wet concrete without an active LDR in place, that might be something that you could send your bomber group to cause trouble. So it's not a complete shutdown of air-based or air-to-ground based combat, but it will probably be a way to curb it to some degree. All right. The final thing to briefly talk about then is also, what about mobile in-hex weapons? So what if there is a bomber in the hex itself, so it's not in the stratosphere layer, it's currently lining up a strafing run, or it's lining up a bombing run to hit a target? Will there be a way for you to have a mobile version of something like an EMG to deploy and use? Now, I think this is also a very difficult thing to implement, because this would also just mean that people that, or players that don't have the forethought of adding in these defenses could, in a pinch, just perfectly counter something that flies into hex to cause a large amount of damage. So I also think that the base vehicles that we have in the game will also have the same restrictions that I've alluded to with rifles and SMGs, etc. Because I don't think it would be fair that if a regiment or if a player group has the forethought and creativity to sneak some bombers into a hex to cause some trouble, that, oh, I can just flip a switch on my falchion or inside of my brigand that I'm already in to immediately pound the aircraft, even though the vehicle wasn't specifically designed to do that. So I don't think tanks need a buff in that sense. I don't think that tanks need to be the perfect solution to air. But I also do acknowledge that it might be useful to bring up some predetermined anti-aircraft vehicle to provide that mobile defense in case you're going into a region that has a very, very prominent air force constantly operating within it. So if the devs were to add in an indirect fire anti-air based platform, I think they could probably repurpose some vehicles or add some new ones in. But if it were me and I had to add in some anti-aircraft vehicles, I think that could be an excellent space for the non-existent highwaymen, as well as add more utility to the Scorpion that has already seen some significant changes in its tech path in the last couple of updates. But that being said, if I look at previous gameplay patterns that the devs have implemented, we never really got an anti-ship tank. We didn't really get any of that. We had the ability to use artillery to counter ships, and that system kind of worked, but I really don't think that we're going to get much anti-air vehicle-based combat. I think a good place for me personally would be more proactive defense using emplaced weapons and push bunkers and push trenches that have the anti-air capabilities built into them, as well as making use of a quote-unquote weather station level defense to spot aircraft coming into the hex. I think that's perfectly fine, but I really don't think we're going to get Super Air Destroyer 9000 the tank .jpg patrolling borders and patrolling attacks to defend against aircraft. I think it would be a little bit strange if the devs were to suddenly just add that in. So it could be cool, but I doubt it. I don't think tanks are going to be the way to defend against aircraft. EMGs and fixed positions, that seems more quote unquote realistic. And again, there were no real World War One era, World War One or World War II era tanks to do this. Yes, infantry in a pinch shot up, or they may have used a machine gun to inflict some damage, but I don't know, if you just go look at the historical influences that the devs used to inspire the gameplay loops within Foxhole, a fixed anti-aircraft gun inside of a trench with a nearby radar to detect the aircraft coming, that seems more plausible to me than, just turn my falchion up and shoot it. Struggles from the same aiming systems that I spoke about earlier, but again, there might be some anti-aircraft tanks. I'm willing to be wrong here, but I don't think that tanks are going to be the way to defend your base against aircraft. It would be a little bit strange, in my opinion. All right, so just in summary, how do you defend against planes that are coming into the hex itself? So they're lining up their aircraft to shoot you or to bomb you. You get inside player-manned EMGs and EATs, or as well as the 75s and the 94s. Maybe there will be some vehicles here and there to defend against it, but the sort of best defense that you have is to build a really good bunker base with concrete defenses on it, and then attach those concrete defenses to your bunker base network that has a long distance radar attached to it, which will give it a boost to its AI to basically shoot down aircraft as they approach. And to defend against planes inside of an air hex, I don't think that there's going to be a passive defense to do that. So again, the LD radar only makes artilleries shoot aircraft in hex, or AT garrisons shoot in hex as well. But to defend against aircraft that are about to descend an attack, you would need to use player-manned artillery platforms. So this will be your Warden 120 guns, so this will be your Colonial rocket artillery positions. And you need to use intel from your superstructure. So your LD radar is used to detect the aircraft that it's approaching. But ultimately, to defend against aircrafts inside the air hex, you need to send QRF. And the best way to do that, I think the most prominent way that that's going to work is going to be aircraft QRF. Right. Now, out of the two systems I described here, because I did give a lot of solutions to air to ground-based combat, the devs have been notorious to not give us the perfect solution on release. So I do think that in the most likely event of things being released over time, which is what the pattern was for Inferno as well as the pattern inside Naval Update, I do think that we will most likely see the fact that aircraft probably get active manned player defense counterplay first, and then we will get the LDR like in-hex passive defense to defend against these sort of attacks. So if I were to put my money on things, it would be existing in-placed weapons or existing weapon systems that simply just have a new fire mode to defend, requiring player participation, and then later on the devs might add something in to cause the aircraft to be shot down, to create no-fly zones, and ultimately prevent low-pop assaults from happening. All right. And then additionally, the final thing to talk about is, and this is something that I've been cooking up, and primarily the reason why this video took so long to come out, is the devs have introduced an alternative to defending. And I just want to throw this out here. I think it's super interesting because this could also be applied to non-airborne based mechanics, but I think it will be more prominent going forward. So I really want to talk about the Underground Fortress. So the Underground Fortress is a very interesting new mechanic that the devs added, and it simply is just a different way to defend your base by simply making a structure and defending it against infantry. Now, for those who don't know what the Underground Fortress is, this is a new superstructure that the devs added, and it goes counter to the previous design decisions that they've made. So the Underground Fortress cannot be destroyed by artillery or outside sources of explosions. To destroy an underground fortress, you need to physically send players inside and demo it with internally placed explosives. And to me, this structure seems to have, it's the first type of structure that players can build that don't result in a direct counterplay to a new mechanic that the devs have introduced. So in previous versions of the game, when fire was added, for example, water was a thing to counterplay it. You would have water buckets, and then eventually we got fire engines, and now we have fire suppression systems. And the same with artillery weapons. When artillery weapons were added, howitzers were quickly followed alongside of it. Howitzers would retaliate against artillery, and then howitzers countered our howitzers, and then that got removed. And again, there was some direct counterplay to it. And then when tank spam was very, very prominent, the devs added in there was already anti-tank mines, but now we have anti-tank minefields. We also have Dragon Teeth to limit the amount of flexibility that tank lines had. And again, these were direct, something X was introduced and something Y was introduced to counterplay it. But the Underground Fortress is super interesting, and I'm very curious to see how it's going to play out in the next couple of wars before Update 63 drops, is that the Underground Fortress can simply be used to counter air now, if you think about it. I mean, realistically, why would you send in an air raid? Probably because you can't overcome something with artillery. And the way that you can overcome something with artillery, or the way you can counteract artillery now, is to either counterplay it with other artillery, or to have a defensive position that's incredibly hard to crack. And the Underground Fortress provides that gameplay loop. So here I have this theoretical sort of bunker-based design that is specifically tailored to defend against aircraft. And this uses the sort of long-distance radar that I added, as well as something to shoot up into the stratosphere hex, as well as something to defend within hex. A lot of counterplay mechanics in this sort of bunker-based design that I have in mind to sort of counterplay air. But then I thought of you know, if I want to defend my bunker base specifically against air, why don't I just do this? Like, why do I not just make a bunker base and then add in some underground fortresses to have a way to deploy into the area to repair damage or to just survive? And then I just have active defenses for non-air. Just defend against partisans, against ways for people to rush into the underground bunker and defend it against like satchel rushers or havoc rushers or hydra rushers. And then I just use that bunker base in a sort of indirect way to defend against air raids. And then I also thought of, well, if the devs are open to giving us the ability to build underground and allows us to deploy certain weapons in specific ways, what's to stop them from just adding more to this mechanic? It's super interesting, and it was a really big surprise that the devs added the underground fortress in update 61, because it's now opening the possibilities of ways for us to defend areas without directly building concrete and then having to sustain and maintain it. So what's to say in the future we might have an underground fortress that could deploy vehicles? What if we have an underground fortress that is specifically like a way to generate spawns through the critically wounded soldier system? Why is there more underground fortress features added in from storage safe houses? Like, what if there's an underground fortress variant that the devs introduce that makes all your bunker pieces like immune to damage from artillery below a certain percentage point, and it requires you to breach into them to cause trouble? It's super interesting, and I'm very curious if the devs are going to explore this further, because ultimately we might have a completely different way to defend against air. And that's why the underground fortress is such a conundrum. And again, I might be overthinking it, but it's a possibility. We could be seeing a completely different way to play the game, where instead of just actively having to defending things, what if our stuff just gets destroyed, but we have an easy way to reconstitute it by just building it off of husks? Something to think about. And I'm very curious to see if anyone has additional thoughts with the introduction of the underground fortress. Again, I might be thinking into it, but what if the best way to defend against air is to not defend at all? And instead, we just take it. But it's more affordable for us to rebuild and reconstitute and try again. So, maybe that's an alternative way that air could play out. Alright, but that's it for now. Very long VAP video. Again, my apologies, it took a while to get this all down into slides and get my thoughts out in speech, but I think it's important that there might be different ways that the Airborne might play out now. And update 61, I think, was a significant directional shift that Siege Camp has shown to the game itself, and I'm curious to see how things are going to develop. But that being said, they have one more update to change things again, so update 62 and then Airborne afterwards, and until then I have at least one more YAP video in mind, and that's to talk about air-to-air combat. I will admit that I need more information from Siege Camp about how this will work. There's a lot of suggestions that I've seen on Reddit on how things might play out, and some people have been making prototypes of air combat on YouTube, and those have been awesome. But again, hopefully the devs release another teaser trailer. Hopefully the devs show their hand a little bit in the next dev stream. Be super curious to see. And then finally, the other thing to talk about is hangars. So like, how are aircraft going to be deployed from? Is it going to be facility built? Is it going to be world built? Again, more information required, but that is something that I'll probably yap about in the 4th video in the series. But that being said, thanks for watching. Hopefully something to get everyone to think about. I'm super interested to see how the combat will play out. But until then, think towards the skies. And of course, good luck for update 61 and 62 for all the wars. It's been a lot of fun. Let's keep the positivity going. All right, that's it from me. I'm out.